Amy Bucher. We're going to stay on this theme of motivation and behavior. She is the author of Engaged, which is a book about behavior change design. Dr. Amy Bucher is a colleague of mine. She's our VP of Behavior Change Design. And whether it be smoking cessation, physical or mental well-being, better savings or spending habits, at MadPow, Amy focuses on applying the science of motivation to help our clients craft solutions that help change behavior. Amy today is going to talk about how applying behavior change design methods can make it more likely that your work delivers strong outcomes and a strong defensible ROI. So here's Amy Bucher.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being a part of FXD. This is really one of the highlights of my year to get to hear from and talk to so many brilliant people who are doing great work in the financial experience space. I'm here today as an evangelist. I believe that embedding a behavior change design approach, or more importantly, really a mindset, into your product organization can help reduce some of the risks that are inherent to product development. I contend that the behavior change design process, by its very nature, helps to mitigate some of the specific risks and increase the opportunity for product success. So a key point that I'll make today is that using behavior change design doesn't mean that you won't make mistakes along the way, but it does offer you a toolkit that you can use to quickly identify when you're on the wrong path and make corrections so that you ultimately spend less time, effort, and money to arrive at success. The product risks that I'm speaking of specifically, here are 6 of them that I've seen time and again in my career working with product organizations. I've tried to roughly organize them according to where in the development process you might encounter them. And they are not having clear success metrics, building a product that doesn't actually address a problem in the market, building a product that doesn't fit people's lives, having a product where the features don't lead to the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, having a product that users don't find engaging or worth using, or having a product that goes to market and doesn't produce the intended results once it's there. Behavior change design can mitigate each of these risks. So I'm going to talk to you about how. Just to make sure that we're all speaking the same language, I like to level set with an explanation of what behavior change design is. It's still a newish field. It's really emerging into its maturity now. And there are some differences in vocabulary and approach. So I feel it's always helpful to level set, as I said. We follow a 4-step process here at MadPow, and I'll share with you what that looks like. In other organizations, I've seen people label the process differently or break it into a different number of steps. But essentially, they have a core similarity and follow the basic scientific method. So here's how we do it at MadPow. We start with diagnosis, where we explore the problem space as it specifically relates to our users and their contexts. During this phase, we really want to understand the current state so that we can begin to consider solutions that make sense. 2 specific goals during diagnosis that are going to be really important when we think about mitigating risks are defining the success criteria for the product and defining the specific user behaviors that we need to encourage in order to achieve those outcomes. Some of the activities that we might do here include things like a literature review or stakeholder interviews to understand the business context we're working in, and primary research with user groups to really dig in on what their experience looks like. And we'll also have a couple of behavior change frameworks in mind that shape our approach at this stage. During prescription, we begin to think about a solution set for the problem space based on what we've learned. And this is where we really apply those behavior change frameworks to identify approaches that have been successful in similar circumstances in the research. We might do early prototypes or requirements here, get those in front of potential users, really try to figure out if we're building something that fits people's needs. In the implementation phase, this is where we really start to get into product requirements and building whatever the thing is that we've defined. So for someone like me who focuses on the research and strategy side, this means working really closely with my design and development colleagues to ensure that whatever we're creating brings through the behavior change ingredients with fidelity. We'll continue to research in this phase as well. We research the entire time because we always want to be checking against the evidence and making sure that we're getting perspectives on what we're doing. Which is why, even though the last phase is evaluation, it's a little bit misleading. It's not truly linear. That research runs all the way through. But one of the things that we do spend a lot of focus on is making sure that once a product is out into the market, we really understand what its impact is. And we understand that in a granular way, both so that we can measure whether or not it's been successful, and so that if it's not meeting the mark in terms of what it's achieving, we understand enough to go back and make the iterations that we need to do. These results in the the evaluation phase really form our evidence base for the product moving forward as well. So it's really important for marketing and ensuring that there's interest in that product. So you'll notice that most of the activities that I've described are familiar for other UX specialties. And that is absolutely true. I like to use the metaphor of sunglasses for behavior change design. We're seeing design and research through a different set of lenses. And that really is the behavior change design theories and frameworks that we bring into the work. So just to put a fine point on it, this is what I consider to be the sunglasses, the colored lenses of behavior change design, and how we are a little bit different from other UX specialties and able to do some of this risk mitigation. So the things that are a little bit different about behavior change design, we focus on target behaviors. You'll hear me say that a lot if you ever work with me. I'm always asking, what are we trying to get people to do? We use psychological theories and frameworks to ground our research and design. We're always bringing those into our approach. We consider affect, cognition, and motivation as drivers of behavior. So we will ask a lot of questions about what people are thinking, feeling, and believing. The things we create, we call them interventions. Those are anything that is designed to help people behave differently in the future. And so that is also a little bit of a different point on design. And lastly, we have this focus on measuring and monitoring behavioral outcomes. So with all that level setting established, let's get into how behavior change design can combat those 6 risks in the product development process. The first one I mentioned, and this is a huge risk, is having unclear success metrics. You won't know if you're successful unless you know what success looks like. So fortunately, as I discussed in the overview of behavior change design, a really early step, a really important step during the diagnosis phase is to establish success metrics. And we do it by working closely with our stakeholders. So if in the case of someone like me who works as a consultant, that's typically people in our client organization, and understanding what it takes to reach those success metrics by doing research. The behavior change design solution to this problem essentially is to invest in a solid plan. And I've had this reaction before where people say the behavior change design process seems very front-loaded. It absolutely is. We're putting the time into creating the plan so that then we can execute on it and reduce the risk later on in the process. Ultimately, it ends up saving time, even though it feels like we're spending a lot of time early on. A specific tool at the heart of this planning is something that I call the outcomes logic map. So it's a tool that establishes a logical thread between those success metrics that we're spending the time to define in great detail early on, the behaviors that we're trying to encourage our users to do, those target behaviors, and then their use of our product or intervention. So this is the most basic form of an outcomes logic map, and you can see the elements laid out here in a timeline from the ones that we detect earliest, which we call the leading indicators. Those tend to be things like baseline data or use of the product, which we can measure pretty much right away, all the way through ones that occur later on in time, the lagging indicators. And these are things like people changing their behaviors in the real world, and then the results that ultimately produces. Building out this tool is one of the things that we do in the diagnosis phase of design. The first 2 pieces that you're able to complete are typically the ones on the ends, that your most leading and your most lagging indicator. So as I mentioned, often the long-term outcomes are shaped by organizational leaders. So for us at MadPow, that's often the people in our client organization that we're collaborating with on the project. If you're in-house or you lead an organization yourself, you might look to the industry to help you establish what those outcomes might want to look like. For the success metrics that you want to achieve, you want to establish what those look like among your customer base or the population at large today as well. That's your baseline. You don't know what your change looks like if you don't know what you're changing from. So it's really important to understand the baseline situation as well. And the example you'll see me building out today is really about helping somebody to retire, on time or earlier, because that's the dream, right? But really looking at all the different behaviors that you might need to see in order to prepare somebody for retirement. So of course, in order for a product to produce successful outcomes, it has to be something that people want or need to use, which brings us to the next risk, which is that you create something that maybe is effective or could produce the results you're looking for, but nobody's interested in it. There's no market for it. And this might be because the product doesn't actually correspond to a problem people are experiencing. We see that sometimes where the user doesn't notice that there's a problem or doesn't agree that there's a problem, or it might not fit into the way that they behave. So I always think of infomercials where they show somebody using basic products really badly or wrongly, but people have quirks in the way that they live their everyday lives. And if you don't understand that as a designer, you might miss an opportunity to build a product that fits into their routines, which is really important when we think about both desire to use the product and then ability to adopt it into people's lifestyles. But good news is, again, the work that we're doing up front with the plan and that outcomes logic map is going to help prepare us to tackle this, because part of what we're doing with that outcomes logic map is we're connecting the what to the how. So we're not just thinking about what are the outcomes we want to produce, but we're getting really specific really early on about the behaviors that we want to see people engage in that should lead to those outcomes. And we're going to do the research to make sure that that actually happens. So the way that we do this is actually really fun. This is one of my favorite parts of the product development process. And it's when we start to brainstorm what all the target behaviors, the things that we're trying to affect with our product might be. So we have our product vision. And in this case, it's that we're helping people to achieve their retirement dreams on time. And now we sit down and we think together, what are the different behaviors that might actually help that become a reality? And these are going to be based on our professional expertise, our past experience. I mentioned that behavior change designers do literature reviews, so they're often candidate target behaviors that come from previous projects that have been published. But we're going to write it all out. This is brainstorming. No idea is a bad idea. We really want to think exhaustively about all the different levers we might have available to us to push in order to get to the outcomes that we want to achieve. So this is a lot. We need to figure out in any given product which ones we want to target. Of course, no one product can do everything. So the next step after this is to actually rate and prioritize the target behaviors that we've thought of. And we do this in a really structured format. So while brainstorming might feel freewheeling, this is where we start to buckle down and get a little bit more disciplined. And we'll often actually create a score sheet where we put all of those target behaviors and we start to rank them on criteria that we've selected for this project. The criteria might vary a little bit depending on what exactly you're working on and what your business interests are, but a few things that you should really include. So first of all, you want to make sure that you are focusing on the behaviors that are most likely to get you to the target outcomes. So you're going to have some kind of effectiveness rating. Is there evidence that this behavior is actually going to work? You're also going to want to consider some practical things. Do we have access to the people who do this behavior? Can we actually influence them? Are we working in a product medium where we can actually change this behavior? So if the tools at your disposal are all training related, then you may not be able to do things that fall outside of training. So that's an important thing to consider. And this is a real place to mix the practical with the aspirational. But ultimately, what you want to end up with is a shorter list of things that your product is going to try to do. So we've added these here to the outcomes logic map. And then as you can see, the final step is to figure out how much intervention or how much usage of your product people need to engage in order to get people to do the behavior change. And it sometimes comes as a surprise. I'm always surprised that people are surprised, but it does surprise people sometimes that the answer to this question about how much product exposure do people need usually isn't as much as possible. There's usually a much lower dosage that is the right dosage for people to get to get to goal. So in this case, we've decided that in order for people to make effective changes in their retirement savings, they're going to need to, first of all, enroll in the product. That's typically an important step. They have to use the thing. And they're going to have to visit it a certain number of times per year. There may be important choice points that we present people with where they have to decide what they're going to do with their money. We want them to read educational articles because we have research that suggests that this kind of education is going to help them make better choices when we have them come in and do that. And we're going to have them log specific actions like maybe approving a recommended asset allocation. So we've done some work up front to decide this is what a successful interaction with our product is likely to look like. We've documented that. And now this becomes something that we can measure against as we put our product out into market. All right, so we've designed a product that does effectively address the market need by targeting the right behaviors to produce outcomes. The next risk is that the product doesn't fit people's lives, that they might not enjoy it. It might not be something that they like, or that oftentimes it's too cumbersome to fit into people's lives. We don't always understand that people don't want to spend a lot of time on the problems that we think are really important. They want to set it and forget it. And we see that a lot in the finance world. People are not generally interested in spending a lot of attention on their money. So we need to keep that in mind as we're designing our products. And the good news is, again, behavior change design can help. So here the assist comes from a hallmark of using behavior change research. When we go out and try to understand our users, we're doing it, as I mentioned, with theories and frameworks in mind that help us understand people in context. So this is a really basic one that I'm about to share. It's called the Bronfenbrenner Ecological model. And I would say this is almost something that I always have in the back of my mind when I think about behavior change problems. So at its simplest level, what it tells us is that people exist in a system. So we exist in the system of our families, our workplaces, our communities, and we can continue to broaden out what that system looks like all the way to things like our culture. And we do know that there are really significant cultural differences in the way that people think about money and the way that they use money. So depending on the specific behavior change problem that we're working on, this is something we need to consider. We talked earlier about ensuring to select target behaviors that will actually bring about desired outcomes. And another risk is that the design choices that we make in the project don't actually influence those target behaviors. So we build something, it doesn't do what we hope it would do. But good news, yet again, behavior change design has tools that we can use to help combat these risks. And they come in the form of specific frameworks that we find useful. So one that if you've encountered me or MadPow in the past, we use a lot, and it's because it's specifically good at this, is the COM-B model of behavior change and the behavior change wheel. COM-B is an acronym. As a good behavior change designer, I've defined my target behavior, and that is the B. And when I do my research, I'm going to want to consider what are the things in the environment that might be stopping people from performing this target behavior. I'm going to classify those according to the C, the O, and the M. It's capability, opportunity, and motivation. When we use the COM-B model, we do embed this right into our research approach. So we are asking questions of people, we are observing their behaviors in context and really trying to understand where they might be experiencing capability, opportunity, and motivational barriers. Once we figure that out, what we can then do is use this model to determine what types of interventions, what types of products might be most effective at helping people to do those target behaviors given the barriers that we've observed. So this is an example, it's the intervention function chart that comes with the COM-B model. And it starts to help us narrow down what our solution sets should look like in order to get those target behaviors to be more frequent, to get people to do what they need to do to get to the product success outcomes. So when we use the COM-B model, one of the ways I like to think of it, it's a rigorous approach and it reduces the risk that we reach for a hammer when we really need a screwdriver. Even if the product does work, though, and it's easy to use, there's no guarantee that it will be engaging. And what engaging means to me is that people have an emotional connection with the product. They're inspired to use it ongoing. It's something they enjoy. So it's a risk that you build something that maybe works, but people don't really care for it. For many products, users are going to have a choice of competitors on the market. So you're typically not operating in a vacuum, and people could choose a competitor instead if you don't hit this engagement metric. So this is where the psychology of motivation comes in, and this is a passion area for me, really understanding what motivates your users so that you can design to meet their needs. To do that, we bring in theories like the self-determination theory of motivation. And let me show you just really quickly. I'm not going to go over all of this, but we understand that depending on what is behind a person's motivation, they are more or less likely to engage in a behavior over the long term. We want to connect to the things that people actually value. Their goals, their values, their sense of self, the things that are really personal to them. And so as product designers, we need to understand that so that we can start to make those call outs to those things in our product. Once we get a sense for that, the other thing that we can do in our design is make sure that we're creating experiences that support three basic fundamental needs that all human beings share. And these are autonomy, which is making meaningful choices for yourself, really relevant in the financial experience space. Competence, or feeling like we're making progress. We have some sort of growth or change based on what we've done. And then relatedness, which is feeling connected to something greater than ourselves. So how a product supports these three needs, it can take a variety of forms. It really depends on the context. It depends on the product itself. But the most engaging products do support one, two, or all three of these needs. So the final product risk is a real doozy, which is after all of this research and planning, the product launches and it just doesn't work. And that happens. It's not great, but it happens. And it can spell the end of the product if the team behind it isn't willing or isn't able for some reason to figure out what's wrong and spend the time to fix it. So the research focus that's embedded in behavior change design, of course, a lot of it is to establish an evidence base for the product, but part of it too is to be able to address these sorts of issues. I really like to think of all of the various bits of research that we do during the behavior change design process as building a story. So, with each little study we do, we're writing a chapter, and taken together, they tell the full story of our product. The more that we've prodded from different angles and collected different data, the more that we're able to basically identify the points where that story doesn't hang together. So, think about that research as giving you the tools that you need to identify what specifically might be wrong when there's an issue with your product on the market. This is just a quick overview of some of the different types of research that are in the behavior change design outcomes toolkit. And again, depending on the product, depending on the purpose, you may do some of these, you may do all of these, but they all build a different part of the story. The research mindset equips you to quickly test alternatives when you're not sure why something might not be working. And that is a huge part of de-risking feature development. So again, it's something that I think sometimes people feel is investing a lot of time that may not be necessary, but in the long run, it really does reduce that risk. So I'm going to leave you with a little bit of a story because I feel like I've talked about being able to de-risk a product, even being able to get something out on market that maybe doesn't work, but to rescue it from the brink. And I know that feels like a tall order. So I want to leave you with a story that shows you that this can happen. And to do that, I'm going to take you back to 1985, where some of you may not even have been born yet. Some of you may have been children. Some of you may remember it well. In 1985, the video game market in the US was not doing super great, the home video game market. So there was a model for cabinet-based arcade games, but they had home video game systems. Atari, Coleco, Mattel had all done pretty well, sold thousands of units when they first put them out, but sales had kind of bottomed out and there wasn't a lot of activity on the market. The photo that I'm sharing is actually from Atari created E.T.'s, a video game for E.T., the movie. And it was so unpopular that they ended up trashing all these copies of the game in a landfill. So this is an actual photo from the landfill full of Atari games. Meanwhile, there's a new competitor coming out into the US market, Nintendo. So the Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES, had features the competitor didn't. So they had the Duck Hunt game with the plastic gun that you could shoot at the screen and the screen could detect that activity. That was a really new thing. And it also had the sideways scroll on the controller instead of the joystick model. So if you're listening to me tell this story right now, you might think like, hey, I know the NES, I know Nintendo, like that got released and it was a huge hit. But what you might not remember, if you weren't paying attention at the time, is that it actually sold only half of the stock that it had created for the US market. So when the NES first came out, they had a certain number of units available and they brought them to the US and they sold about 50% of those. And that was a real big underperformance. So I'm curious if anyone remembers what turned the tides on that. They released a game that did something really different from anything else on the market. They reconsidered what they were doing. So I mentioned the horizontal scroll on the touchpad. And they put a game out that took advantage of that, which is the Super Mario Brothers game. After Super Mario Brothers was released for NES in late 1985, early 1986, there's mysterious disagreements about the exact date. The system became a hit. So while Nintendo's faced other market challenges since, it's never stopped being one of the dominant players in the US home-based video game market since then. And it's in part because of a willingness to shift their model, to shift their product thinking based on changing market expectations and the research that they've done around that, while staying true to their origins as a gaming company. So they not only do they have this origin as a gaming company, another thing that a lot of people don't realize about Nintendo, they've been in business since 1889. And in that time, as you can imagine, they've really had to pivot multiple times, but they've always had that core of being a gaming company. So the product design world will never be risk-free, but I believe that by adopting the data-driven mentality of behavior change design and the tools that allow us to pivot based on what we learn, you can make it much less risky and reap the rewards. So thank you.
Pretty good, huh? That was awesome, Amy. Thanks so much. And it's such an interesting topic. I know everybody loves to hear you talk about behavior change design, some of the methods, some of the measurement, and so on. So I do have a couple questions here I'd love to ask you and get your perspective on.
Great.
One is really about the practice. How do you become a behavior change designer? What are some of the ways that if folks are interested, they can pursue a career or build out a team to do behavior change design?
Yeah, it's still a pretty new field. I think it's something that most of the people I know who do behavior change design added one of the skill sets to their repertoire on the job. So maybe they were educated as a designer, or in my case, I was educated as a social scientist, but then learned how to become a designer on the job. So it's sort of like something you do in practice. There are a few educational programs out there now that explicitly blend behavior change and design. So Carnegie Mellon is a school that has a couple of really great programs. There's a master's program at the University of Pennsylvania in behavior and decision sciences that I find really exciting work is coming out of. And then I always recommend to people who are already in a job where they have the opportunity to do this to try using some of the tools of behavior change design in practice and see how that changes the way they approach their work. So I talked today in the presentation about that outcomes logic map tool. And that's a really
Hmm.
easy one for people to start to work with and try out. And it starts to build in some of the ways that a social scientist thinks into the design process. I've also recommended to people that they try literature reviews. I mean, if you're doing a project where you're trying to increase savings behaviors, look and see what the research says about the cognitive biases people have around how they think about their money and how they manage it, and see what you can draw from that into your design process. And then I also sometimes will recommend as well that people do lens brainstorming activities as part of their design process. And you can really easily take behavior change theories and use them as your lenses. So Todd earlier mentioned self-determination theory. I use that one a lot. And it has these three basic psychological needs of relatedness, competence, and autonomy. And you can use those as brainstorming lenses. Let's sit down and take 10 minutes as a team and think about all the ways this product could specifically support competence. And it starts to infuse a little bit of that perspective into your work. And of course, over time, you can get more sophisticated with that as you get more comfortable.
We did a little bit of that in the workshops, the leadership roundtable activities yesterday, where we did some of the brainstorming using some of those um, techniques as a basis for ideation and sharing. So it was very good. So just validating what you're saying.
Yeah, and I mean,
I guess the
because you and I do this
other,
work together, but we've done it with clients as well, and some of our financial
absolutely.
services clients, where I think we've really seen, good engagement from the folks involved in the design, and then great results on the back end of it.
Absolutely. Yep. Speaking of motivation, Todd did just talk about the six families that were a product of his research and self-determination theory as well. What's your perspective on motivation and its incorporation using any of these frameworks or methodologies?
I don't think that you can do a good job without considering motivation. So it's always a part of my approach. And I do tend to use self-determination theory as my kind of lead framework when thinking about it. And specifically, how do we understand what is really deeply personally meaningful to people and build that into the way that we talk to them, the types of tools that we offer them. I was really excited to hear some of what Todd was talking about. I haven't read his book, but I will. But it sounded like a really great approach to me. And so I'm excited to see how that might play out. And, it is difficult when you're building a product because motivation is so personal. It's kind of a game of trying to approximate it as closely as possible without having the ability to sit down person to person with every single user, every single customer, and have that in-depth personal conversation. But, one of the things that I really enjoy about my work is when I have the opportunity to figure out how to use tools like personalization or like algorithms to make a more scalable way of digging in on those personally meaningful motivators.
Yeah, that's awesome. Great. Well, Amy, it's great to have you part of the program. Like I said, it's always fascinating and interesting. We always get great response. So thanks for being here today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.